The chirping of the birds, the sounds of the crickets, the lone howl of a wolf. These sounds were absent on this night. The heavy downpour of rain filled the night air as heavy droplets hit the earth. The sky lit with the flash of lightning, followed by the low rumble of thunder. That flash illuminated a lone figure, wrapped in tattered garbs. The figure wandered sluggishly, holding herself tightly as she shivered. The cold water touching her pale skin was no more soothing as it was painful against the many scars. Her eyes were unfocused as she stumbled and fell to the softened mud. The damp earth now covering her feeble body, she struggled to look up. The taste of the mud on her mouth as she tried to look ahead. She reached her hand forward, her sharp fingers digging into the earth. They sunk easily in the mud as she began slowly dragging herself forward. The voices behind her had long since vanished, but she could still hear them in her mind. She crawled with the pace of a snail out of the dark woods, coming upon a clearing. In its center sat a lone building, one she could barely make out in design. The flashes of lightning helped lead her to the abandoned edifice. Those voices continued to taunt her. Desperation drove her as she forced herself onto her knees. The door was right in front of her. She made out several planks of wood nailed across the door, but her fear drove her on. She reached her fingers gingerly across the center of the boards and began using what strength she had, pulling each board off. The rain had done its work, weakening the planks, but with each painful heave, she was forced to catch her breath with each removal. As she reached up to hold off another, she was met with nothing. A weak smile came across her face as she weakly used her body weight to force open the door. It opened with a low, aged creaking noise, and she fell. Her body hit the cold, hard, yet dry flooring. A new drive coursed through her as she scrambled inside, doing her best to close the door. As it closed with a satisfying clink, she weakly leaned against it, her energy spent as the dark embrace of sleep took hold of her. Her night was filled with nightmares. The sound of a cracking whip, the jeers, the laughs, the sickening grin. She awoke with a frightened gasp as she timidly looked around. Her memories came flooding back as she winced in pain. She had tried standing, but the scars on her legs caused her knees to buckle. She was caked with dried mud, and the scent of the earth stuck to her. She surveyed her surroundings and let out a sigh of relief. No one had chased her. The building she was in had a high ceiling that met at a point. There were 2 rows of pews in the center of the room, stretching to what appeared to be a stage. Cobwebs had settled all around with a fine layer of dust atop the many seats. She took a deep breath and slowly rose to her feet. She stumbled a couple of times as she made her way to the front of the building, having to use the seats to hold herself up. In the center of the far end was a lone stage area with 2 doors off to each side. Rays of sunlight shone through the gaps in the boarded-up windows to the sides. She gulped nervously as she turned to the front door. It remained firmly shut. As she steadied her breathing, she made her way to investigate. She realized, for the time being, she was safe. She examined one of the rooms and saw that it was like a clothing space. Inside were what appeared to be white robes, much too large for her small frame, yet the clothes were still better than the tatters she wore. She wordlessly made her way to the next door and let out a sigh of relief. Inside was a bathtub, an oddly shaped one, but a bathtub nonetheless. Her relief turned to sadness as she realized she had no way to fill it. There was a window on the opposite wall that was boarded up as well, but through the gap, she could see something outside that she recognized. She shakily made her way back to the entrance of the building, nervously peeking at her head outside. The bright sunlight caused her to squint. Several clouds still stuck in the sky, yet the sun continued to shine its brilliant rays. She slowly stepped outside, having a better footing as she felt the strength returning to her legs. She peeked around the corner where she guessed that room with the tub was, and much to her shock and delight, she saw what she was looking for. Her steps were hurried, and she fell twice as she practically ran to the object of her obsession. a water spout. She recognized its design, and a small hope filled her. She noticed there was a bucket turned on its side laying next to the spout, but the first thing she did was take hold of the metal handle. She heaved and pulled with all of her strength to move the handle upward. She finally got it up, and to her dismay, not a drop of water spewed forth. A sense of pain and sadness took her until she heard the low rumbling. After spitting out what looked like a dark tan liquid, clear, luminescent, pure water shot forth from the spout. She crumpled to her knees as she stared at the most beautiful sight to her eyes. She hesitantly reached her hands out, cupping the clear liquid, and brought it to her mouth. The cold sensation going down her throat sent her into a frenzy, and she began gulping down as much water as she could directly. She began coughing painfully as she practically inhaled it. This was a good pain in her mind. The most delicious thing she had sampled upon for the longest time. She gasped for breath, her body filled to the brim, and she turned her attention to the bucket. An idea hit her, and she carefully looked inside. It was filled with dirt and bugs, but that was okay. She used the water from the spout to clean out the bucket and filled it once more with fresh water. She slowly made her way back to the building with the bucket in tow. She was still weak, and it took her some time, but she made her way back inside and to the tub. It was a long and arduous process as she painstakingly filled the tub more and more with water from the spout. Sweat was dripping across her form, yet she continued to fill it. She weakly stood over the now filled tub. That little light peeking through the gaps of the window made the water shine. She gulped and slowly removed the tatters around her body. The muddy cloth hitting the floor as she stood bare for the world. No fear inside her, she slowly stepped into the icy cold water. The sensation was enough to make her gasp, but she continued, slipping herself into the gentle coolness of the tub. She sat in that water for a time, enjoying the soothing sensations caressing her. Her eyes traveled over the many scabbed over wounds on her body, and she flinched as she remembered where they came from. She shivered. She almost sobbed, and she stayed like that, long until her own body heat had warmed the water. Even if for just a little bit. She was almost at peace. She carefully began to clean herself, delicately so not to cause any flares of pain. The once clear water turned a dark combination of brown and dark red, and she let out a long sigh as she slowly stood out. She could make out a mirror behind her. She almost didn't recognize herself. The pure white skin, the long mane of crimson hair, her own face. She stared at herself for a long time until she shivered once more. She looked to her discarded tatters and walked past them, heading back into the room with the robes. She stared at them for a time before reaching out and beginning to tear them into long intentional shreds. She draped a few of the tatters around her upper section and used the wider parts of the robes to create a makeshift dress to wrap around the lower half of her body. They were tatters, but as she looked in the mirror, she felt this was better than the rags she had worn. She discarded those with little to no hesitation. She let out a sigh of relief. She was safe. Was. The next year was painful. She slowly but surely began to build up her strength, able to freely walk without the stumbling the longer she did. She felt the building was a strong place, a place she could hide, forever if need be. That first week was difficult. After she had cleaned herself, she felt the hunger pangs sweep through her. She knew water wouldn't be enough for her. She needed food. She stepped out of the building and looked around. Much to her surprise, behind the building was an area that seemed off in comparison to the rest of the land. Large weeds had grown in a semicircular pattern with many types of flowers mixed in. She carefully moved her way through the thickets of green and stared at the earth. It still bore its wet scent, yet the ground itself looked darker in comparison. She reached down and pulled a particular weed. As she did so, she was greeted by a familiar scent. She hesitantly put the uprooted plant to her nose and inhaled it. She knew this smell. It was that of an onion. She glanced around and realized that this must be, or used to be, a garden. She began sifting and searching through the weeds, sometimes having to pull them out to look around. To her dismay, she was unable to find anything resembling a fruit or vegetable. As she was about to give up, she noticed another scent. One of rot, yet one that had a sweet scent laced in it. She made her way out of the garden circle and saw the source. Rife with rot was a single pumpkin. It was half eaten, no doubt by wandering animals no less, but still there. She gulped as she was about to resign herself to eating it when she spotted something inside of it she recognized. Seeds. Though some had already perished and had blackened vines seeping out of them, she was able to salvage a small handful of them. She stared hungrily at them for a long time before she made her decision. She began pulling out some of the weeds in the soil, clearing out a small portion. She resigned herself to clearing out the rest later, but this was her best course of action, she realized. She carefully placed each seed into the dirt, hoping and praying that this plan of hers would work. She lacked the experience to know how to properly grow pumpkins, but she used what little knowledge she did have to plant them. The rumbling in her stomach was now louder, forcing her to clutch at her gut. She took a deep breath and then looked to the rotting pumpkin, then back to the forest. She hoped with all of her heart she would find something edible in those woods. Unfortunately for her, that first night was beset by agonizing stomach pains. No amount of water would wash away the foul taste she had endured. The next morning came, and she was surprised by what she saw. As she stepped out into the garden, she saw the tiniest green sprout from the earth that she had cleared out. A sense of happiness took hold of her, but was interrupted once more by the hunger. She recalled her uneventful luck at hunting, but learned that it was possible. She carefully pulled a few more weeds, clearing out more of the area, and took a handful with her. In the woods, she set the crumpled green onto the ground in front of a tree. Taking hold of a large rock, she lay in wait. Something would have to come and examine the greenery, she tried to convince herself. Time passed, and much to her delight, something did come. Enticed by the onion-like smell emitting from the roots, a young deer came. Her eyes focused intently on the curious creature sniffing the roots before lapping at them. She was shaking, a thin layer of sweat covering her as she gripped the rock tightly. She took her chance. With a leap that caught the deer off guard, she flung herself at the defenseless creature. It kicked its legs in an attempt to loosen itself, but its efforts were futile. With rock in one hand and her fingers clamping tightly around the neck of the young deer, she met its gaze. Eyes of fear, eyes she recognized. She hesitated before that pain reminded her. She whispered a silent, "I'm sorry." She now sat in front of a glowing fire. The unmoving carcass next to her filled the air with a silent scent of blood mixing in with the fire, creating a macabre aroma. She was holding the removed leg above the burning flames. It had taken her almost an hour, she thought, to even get the fire started. The weeds she had pulled previously made for decent kindling. She watched as the limb ignited in the flames, the hairs burning off the skin and cooking the flesh. A new, much more pleasant scent wafted in the air as she watched the leg burn. The sizzling flesh made her mouth water, her many teeth beginning to chatter away as she waited. When she believed the limb was well cooked, she hesitantly took a bite, and then another, and then another. Her ravenous hunger matched her thirst from the previous day. It was heavenly to her. This taste was something she had never experienced. As she left only the bone, she stared at it before going to work on the rest of the body. Searching her memory, she tried to recall how the humans prepared such things. Her thoughts trailed to the bones, and she realized what she could do. After getting her fill, she took it upon herself to salvage as much meat from the deer as possible. She used the water from the spout to try and clean some of the pieces, wrapping them up in one of the spare robes she found inside the building. She stared at the remnants of the body, the head left untouched. She frowned slightly before taking the head with her back into the forest. She dug a small hole in the ground with her hands and placed the head inside, burying it. She rubbed her hand over the makeshift grave, uttering a small apology. "Thank you," she whispered before making her way back. The rest of the bones she carefully cleaned and began working on them. She realized some of these could be used as tools. She fashioned a couple of knives from the rib cage and buried the rest. Staring at the rat meat, she pondered how long it would last her. Shaking her head, she thought back to the pumpkin, resigning herself to make it last. The next month came and went. She watched as the seed she had sown had begun to grow at a healthy pace. She continued to remove more and more of the weeds in the area, looking once more through the rotting remains of the pumpkin, unable to find more salvageable seeds. She realized this was her best chance with the ones she did save. She carefully pulled more and more overgrowth, doing her best to avoid the onion roots, in the hopes they too would bear something for her. The meat she had been eating sparingly was showing signs of decay no matter how she tried to clean it. She resigned herself to hunting once more, and this time she was better prepared. With the makeshift knives she had made from the ribs of the deer, she was able to capture many creatures, squirrels, deer, and even a wolf or two. She searched her memory, realizing now she could almost effectively skin them. She discovered the fur of a wolf was very warm and pleasant. The months came and went. She was able to get her strength back, and much to her surprise, the cuts and bruises around her body were beginning to vanish. She felt around her bare back, just barely making out the marks of scars. She stopped herself from remembering, but that didn't stop the nightmares she experienced. By the time she realized it, 4 months had passed. She once again went to the garden to examine her project. Much to her delight, the pumpkin had grown to a healthy size with another, still much smaller one next to it. She realized it was time. With the severing of the root, she freed her prize. Then she encountered her next problem. It was heavy. With a few pushes and grunts, she was able to roll the large pumpkin inside the building. She hollowed out the large vegetable and sifted through its insides. To her delight, she had amassed enough seeds to not only plant, but eat. The outer shell was difficult to eat and tasted rather bland until she attempted to cook it. The shell was easier to get down, but the taste left something to be desired. Much to her surprise, though, she discovered that heating the seeds she put to the side made them edible. It was like a gold mine to her. The onion roots had bared onions for her, but it was still difficult for her to eat them, despite their enticing scent. She felt happy for once. Peace never lasts. Another 4 months had passed, and she had built up much more strength. The inside of the building was much more presentable, with little to no dust being on any seat. She peeked out into her garden and saw the many budding pumpkins growing ever larger, which made her smile. She stared at herself in the mirror, making out her features. The absence of mud and filth accentuated her pale skin. Her hair was as crimson as the sanguine ichor of blood, and it flowed freely, cascading past her shoulders. The old robes had aged and turned a shade darker from constant use, yet it still felt comfortable to the touch. As she was comparing herself in the mirror, a sound resonated through the building. It was the sound she had not heard, nor had she ever expected to hear. A low, dull knocking at the front door. She could hear the bone support she set rattling. She tensed up, unable to move, until another knock made her jump out of the room and stare at the door at the opposite end. It shook, with another knock followed by a voice.
Hello? Is anyone
It
home?
sounded male, she noticed. She carefully made her way to the door, silently so as not to make a sound. The knocking stopped briefly. She gulped silently as she hesitantly tried to peek through a crack in the door, only to be met with a pair of eyes meeting her gaze. She immediately shut the door, pushing herself against it.
Leave me alone!
She cried out fearfully. It was a human, she realized.
A human? A human? A human? Why now?
She was asking aloud to herself until she realized nothing was pushing back against the door. She heard the person on the other side mutter something.
So there was one here.
It was in a hushed, almost amazed tone. The human spoke up.
I'm sorry. I swear, I didn't mean to scare you. I just saw the garden and wanted to see if someone really was living here.
She didn't respond. Her grip was tight, and her pressure on the door unfaltering.
Well, sorry for bothering you. The name's Victor.
He continued to speak without her responding.
I heard rumors that someone took residence here, but I didn't think the rumors were true. I hate to assume, but are you a monster by chance?
He wasn't pushing on the door, but he wasn't leaving either. She didn't stop pushing the door, yet once again he kept talking.
Well, I've never really gotten the chance to see a monster up close, so I was curious. I'm really sorry.
His voice sounded sincere. It wasn't jeering, it wasn't laughing. He wasn't laughing at her. He wasn't.
He is a human,
she told herself.
Sorry again, I didn't mean to scare you. Can I just talk to you from here? I haven't talked to a monster before.
He wasn't pushing the door. She let out a loud sigh and leaned against the door, clutching at her chest as she caught her breath.
I'll take that as a yes.
With that, Victor began talking to her from the other side. She was remaining quiet through it all.
I gotta say, you really did a great job with this place. You got a lot of pumpkins in that garden. Hell, I thought nothing would grow from there. Did you know this place has been abandoned for years now? I'm surprised it's still standing.
She could hear the genuine surprise in his voice as he spoke. She remained silent as she listened to him. She learned he was from a village not far from this place. She searched her memory from almost a year ago. She couldn't recall passing any villages, so she realized it might have been in a different direction.
Ah, crap. It's getting late. Sorry for bothering you, miss.
He sounded like he was unsure of what to say.
I gotta get home or Pa will tan my hide. Would you mind if I came again tomorrow?
Yes, I would.
She spoke only to immediately cover her mouth, a bit too late.
All right, you can talk. All right, miss, I'll come by tomorrow then.
She could hear his footsteps running off, and finally the tension left her body as she lay slumped against the door. Her heart was racing, and she gulped deeply. Much to her surprise, though, he didn't force his way in. She stayed like that for a time as she ruminated this event. She shook her head. She let her guard down around a human. She needed to be ready next time. The next day came after a troubled night of sleep. She was constantly waking up from the old images of the nightmares she had once suffered. She sat silently, leaning against the door munching on cooked pumpkin seeds when she heard footsteps from outside. She shook and almost choked as the familiar knock rang through the building.
Hey, it's me, Victor. I'm back. Are you in there?
He didn't force his way in. This thought kept swimming in her head.
Yes.
She muttered silently enough to be considered a whisper, but it was one the human heard.
That's good. It's a pretty day out today, isn't it? Your pumpkins are looking pretty healthy. Man, you could feed a whole family or two with those suckers.
They are mine,
she muttered.
Oh, I'm not thinking of taking them. I'm just saying you did a mighty fine job growing those.
He was laughing, though it wasn't in the way she recognized. She refused to move from her spot until she heard him moving away from the door.
I'll see you tomorrow then.
He would shout, and it would be that way for a few weeks. The more he came by, the more she would respond to him. She wouldn't dare leave the door, but she humored him by talking. He did not ask for her name again, though, and he just continued talking about minuscule things, talking about how his paw did indeed tan his hide, as he put it, but for a different reason.
Well, what was I supposed to do? Let that goat get away with stealing my sandwich? No way!
This little story actually got a chuckle out of her, much to her surprise. The sound she had made was not a human laugh, but like a soft chittering and chattering noise, emanating from her mouth. She couldn't remember the last time she actually laughed. She eventually came to enjoy these little visits with the human Victor. She would wait, leaning against the door, and listen to him. Until one day.
So, is there any chance I could see what you look like, miss?
This question caught her for a moment, and her heart began racing. She shook her head nervously.
No, not yet.
Not even a peek?
Victor asked. She hesitated before nervously standing and shakily touching the handle of the door. She slowly opened the door just a crack, enough for her to get a short but good look at Victor, and him at her before she quickly shut the door. She noticed the patch of blonde hair on his head and the shimmering blue eyes. He was young.
Wow. So that's what you look like, huh? Never would have guessed that.
he said through a surprised gasp. She was shaking nervously, holding the door closed once more. It had been so long since she had seen a human, but she told herself this wasn't like the other humans. This might have been a nice one. It was an awkward silence before Victor spoke again.
Well, I gotta go. I'll see you later, miss. My dad's gonna be wondering why I'm not doing the chores.
Victor laughed as he ran away. She was doing her best to catch her breath, and slowly she went to lay down, her thoughts filled with uncertainty. She was wondering what to do next. Should she tell him her name? She let these thoughts drift off into her sleep. The next day came and went. Victor didn't show up. She leaned against the door and she sighed, realizing she probably scared him off. She was expecting that, but it nonetheless made her miss the silly time she had spent listening to him tell stories. She sighed with resentment at her actions to let him see her, and she silently made her way to bed, choosing to sleep the rest of the day away. She woke with a start as the door was knocked on quite loudly. At first she thought,
He came back.
but that excitement was doused once he spoke.
Miss, I really need your help.
The desperation in his voice was palpable.
What happened?
She asked as she ran to the door.
It's really bad. Another monster came into the town and is wreaking havoc. I think you might be able to stop him. We can't,
He said.
Why do you think that?
She asked, now confused.
Well, it won't listen to us, and I think it might listen to you. Do you think you can help?
She pondered briefly. He needed her help, she realized. She nodded. Maybe this could be a good thing.
Maybe these are good humans.
She told herself. With hesitation, she began opening the door. She was greeted by Victor, who was holding a torch to illuminate his path. She could see him smiling. Ah, good. I can finally see you now, monster. That last word stunned her. Enough time for a pair of large hands to grab her and force her to the ground.
Victor, what?
Her voice was cut off as she felt a knee bearing down into her back, cutting off her air supply before making her cough.
Tie its arms!
An unfamiliar voice called out, and she suddenly had both of her arms painfully forced behind her, being wrapped tightly in burning hot rope. She felt another rope wrap around her throat, almost choking her as a cloth was tightly forced to cover her mouth, silencing her screams. She was forcibly dragged along the ground by the ropes binding her. She tried desperately to release herself until she saw the many eyes of humans, several staring down at her, each holding a torch. Victor was nowhere in sight. Fear was overwhelming her as she stared at the humans taking her away. A powerful kick was landed in her gut, causing her to writhe in agony.
The freaky one, isn't it?
Aye, it'll fetch a good price, though, if it's female. You know how those sick fucks do. They were laughing.
They are laughing. They are laughing.
Her thoughts were back into that mindset a year ago. She could feel something stirring inside her as she felt another kick to her gut. Get up and walk! You need to look good for the auction! She was shaking. That word. The laughing, the jeers, the stares. She was forced to walk in pace with those taking her away, and her legs were kicked from underneath her, forcing her to trip. This would result in more kicks to her abdomen and even her own head. As she reached what appeared to be a village, she was forced onto the ground, thrown brusquely at the feet of a crowd. She heard many gasps of surprise and fear.
Good job, Victor. You got yourself a good prize.
A voice rang out, followed by a voice filled with sickening glee. Thanks, Pa. It was real tough getting this one. Her eyes widened as she slowly looked up, seeing the smug grin on Victor's face. That grin. That smug grin. That familiar, all too familiar grin seeped into her mind. All of the jeers, the noise, they were fading into a world of only her and that smug, satisfied grin. She felt herself being forced down onto the ground as two men pinned her onto her stomach. She could feel their combined weights bearing down and their pungent hot breath disgracefully touching her skin. She could feel that growing sensation again. Alrighty, let's see what kind you are. One man spoke. He traced his hand further down her spine until he stopped, his knife barely touching her. What the? He froze as he saw something moving beneath the cloth covering her back. It was too late. Before he or his partner had time to react, two arms sprouted from below the skin, covering them both in crimson blood, momentarily blinding them. One of the arms reached out and grabbed the one man by the throat, piercing his flesh until her claws completely gouged his neck out. A sickening snap emanated as her hand perfectly crushed the man's throat. The other hand immediately grabbed the other man's knife and plunged it deep into his throat. He clutched at the now gaping hole in his neck before collapsing into a growing pool of blood. The crowd screamed in fear as she stood up, her head down, allowing her hair to obscure her face. Her bindings undone, as she sliced them off, she stared at Victor, who turned around and ran away. Her gaze immediately turned to one of the men about to pounce on her. It was the one Victor was talking to. She quickly threw the knife at him, embedding it deep into his shoulder before lunging at him with her forearms. As she quickly wrapped her sharp talons around his neck, choking the life out of him, another pair of men charged at her with torches raised. She snapped the defenseless man's neck and flung his twitching body at one of the men before throwing herself as the other distracted man. The crowd was already dispersing and running in fear as she took the torch and jammed it into the man's face. Her anger overshadowed the cacophony of screams in terror. Her target was getting away. She quickly ran past the many fleeing villagers, grabbing torches from her victims and throwing them at each house, setting them all ablaze. Her body was coated in blood, matching the hate-filled hue of her hair. She spotted it. Him. Victor was desperately trying to run and hide, but she was faster. She closed in on him, forcing him to back into a corner as he retreated inside what she assumed to be his own home. She pried the door open and flung it off of its hinges. Her four eyes scanned the room, and she spotted him, hiding in the corner with a lone knife shaking in his hands. He tried to throw it at her, but she easily caught it.
Wait, I'm sorry, it wasn't my idea. My paw. Yeah, it was my paw's idea.
He didn't get another word in as he cried out in pain. She was already upon him, stabbing the knife deep into his hand, pinning it to the wall. He cried desperately, trying to wrench his hand free, yet stuck it remained. She stared at him with hatred, tilting her head before looking to the side and seeing just what she needed. She took hold of the small lantern that had a flame glowing in it, setting upon one of the side tables. She took hold of it, holding it above him. He stared with tears streaking down his face.
You wanted to know my name, didn't you?
She muttered heartlessly as she let the lantern drop. She muttered.
It's Severa.
The lantern fell, the glass shattering and coating the man in oil, its flames eating away at his weak clothing and eventually himself. His cries of agony fell on deaf ears and joined the symphony of agony. She silently walked away from the burning village.